I'm Brandon again, running our co-director at the Virtual Medicine Conference and project scientist here at Cedars working on VR. I'd like to have each of you kind of introduce yourselves and what you're doing in the metaverse. You know, where you're working on in the space.
Yeah. Sure. Well, hello everyone. Is there a mic? Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Dave Rue, and it is great to be back here. I'm not sure if you knew, but I did my medical training here at Cedars-Sinai, so I feel a very strong affinity to Cedars and UCLA, where I also did my training. Over the past many years, I've had an opportunity to look at technology and find how technology can be used to improve health outcomes. Similar to Brandon, and a variety of others have taken a look at how health services research can be applied using technology to improve access to care, quality of care, improve the patient experience, improve operational efficiency, and reduce costs. And over the past 6 years, I've served as Chief Medical Officer for Samsung, really looking at how different technologies, immersive technologies like virtual reality, and some newer technologies can be used to improve health outcomes.
Awesome.
Afternoon, my name's Korak Sarkar. I also have a Southern California connect. I went to medical school in high school, which is a very New Orleans thing, where you go to high school in San Diego, so it's nice to be back in the vicinity. I'm a practicing neurologist, spent about half my time seeing patients specifically with brain injury, and over the last 5 years have developed an interest and a competency in 3D printing and XR and how they're applied in healthcare. And the genesis of that was trying to explain neuroimaging to some of my colleagues, residents, and fellows, and then patients and their families, and it became, very obvious that they really wanted to understand, the blobs on the screen, but it was not very intuitive. The information asymmetry was very real, and it was, very important information. So I was like, oh, I'll just go 3D print this, and it turned out to be a longer journey than I expected, but it's been a great one, and now I spend about half my time as a director of Oxford's Medical 3D Lab, where we're using 3D printing and XR technologies to facilitate patient engagement, medical education, and clinical care delivery. So I'm very thankful to be on this panel.
Hi, I'm Ann Wellington. I'm not a doctor, so I don't quite fit in with this panel, but I've spent my entire career on the technology side of healthcare IT. So I started my career at Epic, and since then have gotten a chance to work in a lot of different capacities, both with Epic, sort of a large vendor, on the health system side as we're implementing new technologies. I spent 4 years as Chief Product Officer at a startup called Stanson Health, and my current role here at Cedars is running our accelerator program. We bring in companies for 3 months to spend time at Cedars collaborating with our clinicians, stakeholders, and other providers to really get feedback on their products and help improve what they're bringing to market. We were lucky enough to have applied VR as one of the participants in our first class, and I get a chance to interact with a lot of other companies as we bring them in. Something that a lot of the companies that we work with through the accelerator program are starting to think about is that question of how do I scale? How do I take something from a really great initial idea that might have some initial validation, a few customers, and really bring that to be a solution at scale? And so I'm excited to speak a little bit from the implementation and operations perspective about scaling really exciting technologies like we're seeing in VR and AR. Own mic.
Carry it with me everywhere I go. Hi, I am Adam Ghazali. I think I probably spoke to most of you this morning. Maybe I'll give a sort of quick view of the different areas that I touch on this topic. So as you may remember, I'm a professor in neurology and neuroscience at UCSF, and I'm the executive director of Neuroscape, which is an academic research center where we both build technology as well as do research studies to validate it. In addition to that, I started Achille Interactive, which is taking the first technology I created at UCSF to market as a medical device, and that's actually at the FDA right now. I also co-founded a venture fund called Jazz Venture Partners, which invests in this same domain, broader than VR, but technology, really non-invasive consumer technology for human performance and enhancement. It could be both medical and consumer. And then I most recently started a company that I just announced today for the first time, SenseSync, which is the virtual reality hardware company. So I've sort of had this really unique opportunity to see this field from the research, entrepreneurial, and venture perspective. So it's been a fun ride.
Awesome, awesome. So I'm curious just to get a general question out to everyone. And then, you know, from research standpoint, we kind of have certain questions we're asking each time, but each point at any project, I've always wondered, well, what about scaling this and other challenges that come with that? So maybe you could talk a little bit about some barriers or challenges that have either been overcome or that you've reached, and then that meant, you know, fork in the road, maybe try something else.
So as you can imagine, Samsung's a pretty large company. In fact, when I joined 6 years ago, I didn't even realize the extent. It's the largest global smartphone maker. 70% of the US population uses at least one Samsung product in their home, whether it's a TV, it's a phone, smartphone, whether it's some home appliance. So we were very ubiquitous, and as you can imagine, scaling has been sort of the big question, or specifically around healthcare and some of the technologies. So this is something I think of all the time, and the challenge is that we are at the same time trying to show that this actually works. And so in the process of demonstrating a newer technology, introducing it to the marketplace, getting clinician buy-in, it takes a while for that to occur. But once you start getting to the point where we are today, where we now know it works, the challenge has really been around some of the things that you heard earlier, FDA, reimbursement, how do you make it easier to implement, and then the simplicity of being able to deploy it in settings both in the inpatient as well as outpatient. The ability for us to be able to provide and marry this with support and programs where we don't typically have programs today that are designed around use of technology. I mean, doctors and nurses are trained on using pills as their treatment, surgery as our treatment, not necessarily around how you use a VR headset or a wearable. So this is a brand new area which is going to require a lot more retraining for the healthcare community for us to be able to figure out how to be able to introduce it. So we run into these all the time at every single level. We find that academic medical centers are better suited to be able to implement some of this, but even they struggle trying to get this in the hands of patients so that they can use this every day. And what we want to do is we want to be able to continue to push things forward, at least from the technology side. Some of the things that we're trying to do, we're trying to understand the needs of what can make our technologies work better, bring that into the product pipelines, figure out ways that we can work with companies, small, medium, and large, to be able to implement, and then figure out how we can build an ecosystem of partners that are interested in trying to make this science become a reality.
Thank you.
This is a great question. That's basically been my charge for the last 12, 18 months. You know, we've shown some initial traction, validation. How do you scale this? And a couple of lessons learned. You know, this is a technology, so there's technological issues, and there's specific, unique things in a healthcare environment, like information security. You know, when you train as a physician, first do no harm, and then you learn about, you know, HIPAA and making sure everything is private. And then what's been novel to me is this idea of security. I thought that was kind of the same thing as privacy, and I've been educated that it's not, you know, to the point where now I know what a man-in-the-middle attack is, and I never knew what that was before. And that's basically the idea. If I have someone in a headset in San Francisco, they want to talk to someone in LA, how do you know it's not Boris in Russia hopping in and telling you the wrong things, or, you know, just messing with you? And those are things that we're learning, and I'm lucky enough to live in a system that's been pretty progressive about that. The EMR, you know, with my clinician hat on, at best it's a frenemy, but, you know, when you're doing innovation, it can really help streamline and optimize and help lower that barrier for adoption. And even things as simple as, you know, when we started going into VR, we were deciding what headset to use, and this was around 2017 or so, and so everyone was using the Oculus, and this is when inside-out tracking was coming in. So before you had to have sensors, set that up, and now you had inside-out tracking, but it was new, relatively risky, and what were we going to do? And somebody has mentioned this before. You got to lower or increase the ease of use. And so we made a bet. We actually use Samsung's HMDs, and that has really allowed us to go to the point of care, to the point of the clinician, to the point of patient, and it's lowered the ease of use so that even some departments independently are adopting these technologies. And then finally, and this is something that I haven't completely solved, is there's a lot of intuitive value to what we're doing. You help a child that's in pain. You give an experience to someone that's in the ICU. You empower a family and their patient about what procedure that they're going to have and what's going to happen. But there's no RVUs associated with that, and we're not asking patients to pay for it. So where is the sustainability? And that's something I think a lot of us in this room are struggling with. And I do think we've gotten past an inflection point where there's enough momentum that someone's going to figure that out, but it's still an unanswered question.
And I'm going to elaborate a little more, dive deeper on what Dr. Rue was saying about sort of the workflow within the hospital and getting stakeholders and clinicians engaged on using the product, because I think that is a challenge, especially as companies scale. If we think of part of scaling a company as slowly moving the product from the hands of someone who cares about it a lot, from the company founders and maybe folks you're doing studies with or research, they really are willing to put in the time to make it work. And that might be 2 minutes for it to start up or 5 minutes to troubleshoot something. But as you move away and have it be available a little bit more widely, you're putting it in the hands of users who aren't committed to that time. I enjoyed Joe's story in the last panel about the emergency room nurse who put the headset on the kid who was really upset. But I think it also speaks to great work on the part of Applied VR that started right away and worked right away, and the nurse could just grab it off the shelf and place it on the child. If that were to take longer or be harder to use, that's not someone who's going to say, like, oh, let me take a few minutes and figure this out. That's going right back on the shelf, and something else is going to get tried. So I think as companies scale, identifying those little pain points that might not seem as significant to you as you're developing it or to the early users, but would be something that begins to move later users away from it, smoothing a lot of that out and really considering those human factors, not only for the patient, but also for anyone else who has to interact with the product, the hardware, the software, things like that, is a really critical way to make sure that the product operates at scale, not only from a technical perspective, but from a user perspective.
So maybe I'll wear my Achilles hat to answer this question. So I was there from day one. Now I think we just passed 100 employees. And so we scaled. We don't have revenue yet, but we've been through a lot over the last 8 years and growing as a company. I think we've raised a little north of 120 million, so we've been pretty well capitalized to scale. And that's what we're in the process of. And I would say 3 things that I've observed as challenges. The first was, and I think these things apply to therapeutic digital medical devices generally, not necessarily VR. VR, I think, has some unique challenges given hardware, software integration. But I think the 3 things I'll say are more general. The first was when you're a digital company building either software or hardware, and you are also in the medical world, you have a lot of employees that come from different backgrounds. At least that was certainly true of us. And so there are culture challenges that we face all the time. We have additional ones because we're half based in Boston and half based in San Francisco. So we have a whole country between our teams, and we're pretty much 50-50. Our creative team, our development team, our analytic team is all, sound production is all in San Francisco, and our medical device team, our legal, our patent group, our group that interacts with payers and the FDA are all in the East Coast. And we spent a tremendous amount of time helping game developers understand why our game is not out in the world yet, why we're waiting on the FDA. And it's a real constant education process across both sides of the tech and the medical side, I would say, to keep everyone sort of on the same page and happy and part of the same mission. And so that's a real scaling challenge. Every time we bring on a group, we have that as a real barrier to scaling. The other side is investment. It's not necessarily that more money is a good thing. More money comes with a lot of challenges, a lot of need for a return of investment. Who your investors are speaks a lot to how you scale and how you present yourself. If your investors are, more classic tech investors or medical healthcare investors, they're very, very different. We have both. We have both U.S. investors and overseas investors, and so it's really complicated, and it's a big part of the challenge of scaling. It's not just more money is opportunity. That's certainly not the case, and it changes your board and how you make decisions. I would say maybe the last part of it is thinking about the technology itself and how we're trying to both innovate and at the same time make nods to the past and also be secure in things that we've already built. So it's really exciting, and you sort of know my style a little bit of being very futuristic, but a lot of, like, for example, Achille doesn't have a VR device yet integrated with it, although we would clearly fit very well with that. Do you need the mobile VR device? So there is like a very enticing desire to bring on everything from the future that you see, but there's also a realism that I think is critical for scaling, in that sometimes you're just like, okay, we're here today, that's okay, that's who we are today, this is going to help us get around the country, around the world, and then tomorrow will be that, sexier future version that we know we want to be.
I thought of one more thing as we were talking, which is I think unique to VR and some other types of companies that have content as part of the product, which is as you scale up on content, the more content you have, the more content you have. And that has to be maintained and monitored and make sure that is the library staying up to date? Are the things that we introduced first still relevant, still best practice? And so there's definitely a balance of wanting to scale up that content library and making a lot available to your customers, but at the same time, putting processes in place to ensure that your 100th piece of content and your 1,000th piece of content are of the same quality as the first one or two, and also that those first one or two don't get left behind as you introduce that 1,000th piece. So I think having structure and process in place to handle that is really critical for any company that has a content library as part of the product.
Great. So I have another question, and that is, we talked a little bit about EMR, and some of you have background in EMR. I'd love for physicians here to have a button they press, and then they can send out, VR, and I can collect data on it. Of course, that's always my thought is whether we get data on it. But do you think having something in the EMR is imperative for full scale, or is it potentially not imperative? How much is the EMR integration, something we all need to think about?
Yeah, so just as a little background, prior to joining Samsung, I was with a company called Zinx Health, which was owned by Cerner for a certain period, so I was actually working at Cerner for a couple of years. And also, having been working at many hospitals that use EMRs, I'm quite familiar with the challenges of that clinicians have to go through in terms of entering in information, how it interfaces with your workflow. The virtual reality experience is really designed around the patient, the individual, and so much of that, the ordering of it can be done through an EMR. That I don't see that as a major barrier. I think if you were to kind of rank order the challenges, EMR is on the list, but it's not going to be your top one. No. It comes back to issues around being able to implement it and get paid for it, and if organizations don't feel like they can pay for it, then they're not going to want to do it. Once the pilot period is over, they won't find it as a sustainable process. So I think that is probably, at least from what I've seen, the more significant issue. I think the EMR issues, it'll be interesting once we start capturing data from these devices, and some of the work that is being done here at Cedars-Sinai and elsewhere, where they're combining the use of virtual reality with wearables and biosensors. Then at that point, I believe that the ability for us to be able to provide deeper analytics and then how that flows into the EMR and the clinician workflow will be certainly much more relevant. But in many of the use cases, it's around creating a transformative experience for that individual, and can you order it? And I think that in that context, it's not going to be a barrier. But down the road, when data becomes a big part of this, then you'll see EMR play a much more significant role. But not necessarily a barrier, but just it'll need to be figured out how you integrate it.
Yeah.
So I look at that question in kind of in 3 phases, and I can testify that you don't need EMR integration to have not just early adoption, but some level of scaling, and quite frankly, it's probably best not to. And now we're getting to the point, and we have the opportunity to work with some of our EMR internal developers, where it will be helpful to scale, to be able to collect that data, and make it a little bit easier to spread the word, as well as for clinicians and end users, patients to actually use some of the applications we have. And then, I'll just throw this out there. We're not necessarily playing in this space, but we see it. Is there a way, EMR is like a 3-letter, 4-letter word to clinicians and maybe even to patients. You can't go into a doctor's appointment without seeing them get distracted. I'm guilty of this too, by the EMR. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist at the end of the day, and I always tell people you can't split your attention. You can't really multitask. You might be able to set shift, but that even is not super effective. And here we are delivering care at scale, shifting from a screen to the patient, to the screen to the patient. So I'll take a nod from Adam and kind of think futuristically and maybe even a little bit radically, but is there a way for XR to at least augment, if not maybe even supplant, the EMR?
I'm going to be unabashedly pro EMR here. And I think that when I think about integration into the EMR, I don't think it's critical from a technical perspective that some of the VR platforms be integrated. That being said, I think especially for therapeutic VR, for a question of legitimacy, if we're saying this is a treatment that the patient is receiving, and this is how we're addressing a problem that they're having, whether it's pain, anxiety, something else, having that documented and captured in the EMR as any other treatment would be is critical to keep it from being separated into, oh, this other thing that isn't really part of their true care. And so I think having some level of integration that allows you to say, we ordered VR, it was administered at this time, this was the impact on the patient after that, and we can sort of chart that against things like vital signs, things like pain score, go a long way in legitimizing therapeutic VR as therapy and as something that really should be part of the patient's medical record, in that EMR as the source of truth on the medical record. So I don't know exactly what that integration has to look like, but I do think there is a place for that to be captured and documented as part of the patient's treatment.
I don't think I have anything particular to add on the EMR question. I think I agree with what's been said. I guess my only addition to this discussion would be that from my perspective, thinking about a therapeutic VR company, or for that matter, any therapeutic digital medical device company, I think it's appropriate to think about yourselves as a data company. Whether or not you are now, if you're going to scale, it is going to be part of the opportunity of having a treatment that's about data. This is something we talk about at Achille all the time. I mean, think about a pharmaceutical company. From the day that drug, that treatment leaves their hands, they're really disconnected from the patient completely. We, as companies that deliver treatments that have basically a data cycle between the patient back to servers. I mean, we have an ongoing data relationship, and that is an opportunity. That data could be can feed back to the patient to reinforce behaviors and help therapeutic outcome. It could be shared with a doctor, a teacher, an insurance company, depending on what makes sense and what's appropriate. Yes, the integration with the EMR is I'd say it's a piece of this much more complex data ecosystem that is the opportunity of these new type of therapeutic companies.
Great. Well, I think maybe we'll just have one more question, but I want to just make it an optimistic one because I feel like I've been talking a lot about barriers and challenges. So maybe we should end it with, let's say, one nice thing about hopes of scaling, or what you've seen that you think that's good about, coming forward in the future. I don't know.
Sure. I can tell you over the past couple of years, there's been so much innovation being made in this area of therapeutic VR. I don't think we even thought of the term therapeutic VR until only in the past couple of years because we had never seen it being used to treat medical conditions. It's now being used just like any other type of treatment. And the clinical evidence behind it, randomized control trials and a lot of observational study data sets, meta-analyses, is strongly supportive of that. What we've seen also is that the technology has advanced to the point where it used to be very expensive. These are devices that were tethered and tied to this big supercomputer and required a lot of ability for a user to be able to figure it all out. Now people can buy their own headset, and literally it can cost a fraction of the amount that you would even imagine to treat conditions that in many ways this works just as well. So I think that we're in an exciting time because technology has become very mobile, it's become consumer friendly, and the consumer devices that we're seeing that are being sold and provided are now being used by clinicians to better manage your care. So it's a great time for us to be able to continue to push this forward. We've got the FDA strongly supportive of these innovations and the rapid pace we're making, and we're also making tremendous strides in terms of introducing this to the payers with many clinical trials underway. Hopefully that'll tip the scales in such a way that we'll see reimbursements start coming forward. It took a while for things such as telemedicine, but that's happened, and I kind of anticipate something similar with virtual care and therapeutic VR to have a similar course.
Two optimistic things, both sort of about access and adoption. And clinicians and patients, and I'm guilty of this too, we think we have the solutions, and quite often we don't. But what we're really good at is understanding the problem, workflows, and if we don't necessarily have the solutions, we're really good at vetting potential solutions and saying, that's not going to work, or if you did this, this would work. And with XR particularly, maybe even more so than 3D printing and definitely other technologies, you see the desire for that. And going back to one of the challenges I mentioned, a lot of people have talked about the sustainability. You see, things like the accelerator here, IDHA, from the inside out, really trying to work on figuring that out, and in a substantive way. And then the second thing is, this is a very esteemed panel, and I'm gonna pick on Adam. He's never met me. He's one of my dork superheroes. He's a MD, PhD. I've seen him interview with Eric Topol, esteemed neurologist, neuroscientist at UCSF, venture capitalist, entrepreneur. And I'm a community neurologist that lives on the bayou in southeast Louisiana, living in New Orleans, and New Orleans is known for a lot of things, but usually is not thought of as this epicenter of technological innovation. And here I am, and if we were at a conference talking about CRISPR technology or advanced diffusion tensor imaging, you wouldn't see this heterogeneity. And on a lot of different axes, you see this egalitarianism that's pretty unique to this field, and I've seen it in adoption. It's true. People are adopting it, and I'm making the bet that it will also hold true in scalability, that this egalitarianism is going to really allow for scalability.
Thank you. I have two things I'd like to mention. One, just broadly when we look at VR, and as someone who gets to look at a really wide range of new technologies in healthcare, one of the most exciting things to me about VR and AR is it is both a sort of moonshot, very exciting futuristic technology that we could see transforming care over the next decades, and it's also something we can use today. And there's not a lot of technology that kind of fills both those boxes. We see a lot of things that are very far out and a lot of things that are sort of practical solutions for today. And so it's exciting to see technology that bridges that and has so much room for future growth. So that's one thing. The other thing that is exciting to me is, I think a lot of times, at least when I think of therapeutic VR, I think more on sort of the physiological things, especially around pain. But some of the most exciting uses, I think, of therapeutic VR are some of the psychological or mental improvements that we see VR being used for things like treating PTSD. I've seen VR applications for children with autism to interact with and help them address some of those challenges. And so I think that one of the other exciting things about therapeutic VR is that it's addressing challenges that patients have that weren't addressable with previous methods. So it's not that previously we could take a pill and now we're going to replace it with VR. Instead, previously we didn't have a good solution, and now we do. And that's really, really exciting.
Okay, I guess I'm wrapping up here. I already talked about the opportunities when it comes to scale for data. I think that's a really important one. I just want to mention another that I haven't heard discussed yet, and I think it's critical, and that's the idea behind about partnerships. In a new field, you don't build a new field as one company. You build a new field as a whole ecosystem of companies doing different things, learning to work together. At Achille, we just announced recently a partnership with a 120-year-old pharmaceutical company, Shionogi, in Japan, who will be distributing all of our treatments in Japan and Taiwan, and that's a really exciting, global opportunity. Within VR, there's the opportunity to be software and partnering with hardware companies. I actively seek out any entity, group, person that might be a competitor and turn them into a collaborator. I mean, there is so much to do here that I think we'll all rise a lot better working together. So that's an opportunity that will lead to scale and this field being healthy for, a long time.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the panel. Yeah.